He thought love was something he had already lived, something he had already lost. At 84, there wasn't much left that surprised him. His days were quiet, predictable, wrapped in the slow rhythm of routine and memories too heavy to carry, but too precious to let go. He wasn't waiting for anything, not for change, not for company, and certainly not for love. But then she appeared, and what happened next changed everything. His name was Walter. He lived in a small house at the edge of town, the kind with creaky floors, old photographs on the walls, and the faint scent of coffee and old books lingering in the air. Every morning, he'd wake before the sun, shuffle to the kitchen, and make himself a simple breakfast: toast, 2 eggs, and a cup of coffee, just the way he always had. There was comfort in the repetition, in knowing exactly how each day would unfold. Walter had lived alone for nearly 20 years. After his wife passed, he filled the silence with small routines. A walk to the mailbox, a visit to the corner store where the cashier knew his name, the occasional Sunday church service where he sat in the back, nodding politely, but never staying long after. He told himself he was fine. He had lived a good life. He didn't need more. But some nights, when the wind rustled through the trees outside and the house felt just a little too still, he wondered if there was more. Wondered if maybe, just maybe, he had given up on something too soon. He would never admit it. Not out loud. Not even to himself. Until one day, when a simple encounter would pull him out of the shadows of his past and show him that even after 84 years, the heart still knows how to hope. But what made Walter open his heart after all this time? And who was the woman who changed everything? Walter hadn't always been alone. There was a time, many years ago, when his house echoed with laughter, when the days felt short because they were so full. He met Helen in 1957, back when everything seemed new and the world was wide open in front of them. She was gentle but strong, with eyes that could calm him in an instant. They married young, built a life from nothing, and never looked back. Together, they raised 2 sons, worked hard, saved every penny they could, and dreamed about the day they'd finally travel. See the places they always talked about on quiet evenings, sitting on the porch with coffee in hand. Life had its ups and downs, but through it all, Helen was his anchor. She understood him like no one else could. Even when they fought, she had a way of reaching into the silence and pulling him back to her. They spent nearly 50 years side by side, and when she fell ill, he cared for her every day until the very end. After she was gone, the world seemed smaller, quieter, less colorful. Walter didn't know how to be without her. The first few months, people came. Friends, neighbors, even distant relatives who hadn't visited in years. They brought food, shared stories, offered help. But slowly, as time passed, the visits stopped. The calls became less frequent. And Walter, who had never minded solitude in small doses, began to feel its weight in every corner of his home. He tried, in the beginning, to keep busy, fixing little things around the house, tending to the garden Helen loved so much. But it wasn't the same. The roses didn't bloom like they used to. The house creaked louder at night. And the coffee, even that didn't taste quite right anymore. Years slipped by in this quiet way. He watched others move on, remarry, start new chapters, but he never imagined that for himself. He wasn't bitter, not really. He just accepted that some people only get one great love, and he had already lived his. That thought, while sad, gave him a strange sense of peace. But underneath it, hidden deep, there was something else, something that felt unfinished. He didn't talk about it. When his sons visited, they spoke about practical things, bills, the roof that needed fixing, the weather. They loved him, he knew that, but they had their own lives. Families. Responsibilities. And he didn't want to be the old man who asked for more than he should. So he settled into a life of small comforts. A favorite chair by the window, the morning newspaper, the occasional sound of laughter from kids playing down the street. It was enough. Or so he thought. Until that day at the park. A day like any other. A bench, a book, and a stranger who would change everything he believed about endings. The sun was warm that afternoon, casting soft light over the park where Walter often went to sit and read. It was one of the few places that still felt alive to him. Children running, dogs barking, the distant hum of conversation drifting through the trees. He liked the familiarity of it, the way he could be alone but not entirely. That day, like many others, he found his usual bench beneath an old oak tree, the one with roots that twisted out of the ground like the fingers of time. He opened his book, the same one he'd been reading for weeks, not because it was long, but because he often found himself staring at the pages without really seeing them. He was lost in thought, somewhere between a memory and the present, when he heard a voice. "Mind if I sit here?" Walter looked up, blinking against the sunlight, and saw her. She had kind eyes, the color of warm honey, and short silver hair that curled gently at the ends. She smiled, not the kind of smile that asks for permission, but one that simply offers presence. He hesitated for a moment, then nodded, moving slightly to make room. She sat down with a soft sigh, placing a small bag beside her feet. For a few minutes, they sat in silence. Walter glanced at her, trying not to stare. She seemed comfortable, at ease, like someone who belonged anywhere she chose to be. He returned to his book, though now the words seemed even less important. "Nice day," she said, breaking the stillness. He nodded. "It is." She looked at him, her eyes crinkling at the corners. "I come here sometimes, when the house feels too quiet." Walter felt something shift inside him, a recognition. "Me too." They didn't say much more that day. Just small comments about the weather, the park, the way the seasons seemed to change faster than they used to. But when she stood to leave, she turned to him and said, "I'm Ruth." "Walter," he replied, standing slightly as she walked away. The next day, she was there again. And the day after that. At first, their conversations were light, simple exchanges about the world around them. But slowly, something deeper began to take root. Walter found himself looking forward to those afternoons, to the sound of her voice, the gentle way she spoke about her garden, her late husband, the places she had always wanted to see. There was a softness in her that made the sharp edges of his own loneliness dull. One day, she brought him a small tin of cookies, homemade, warm with cinnamon and sugar. "Just a little something," she said, placing them in his hands. He didn't know what to say. No one had done something like that for him in years. "Thank you," he said, his voice quieter than he intended. She smiled. "You look like you could use a little sweetness." And maybe, he realized, he could. As the days passed, Walter began to feel something he hadn't in a long time. A quiet pull, a gentle nudge towards something new, something uncertain. It frightened him, this feeling, but it also lit a small flame inside him, one he thought had long since gone out. But could he really let himself feel again? Could he open his heart, after all this time, to someone new? Walter had always believed that certain parts of life came with an expiration date. Love, adventure, even the excitement of possibility. Those were for the young, for those still filled with the energy and time to chase after them. At 84, he figured he had already experienced everything he was meant to, and whatever remained was just the slow, steady winding down of a life well lived. But Ruth was gently pulling him away from that belief, without even trying. Each time they met, she brought with her a lightness that unsettled him in the most unexpected way. It wasn't just her smile, or the way she laughed at things he didn't think were all that funny. It was the way she looked at the world, like it still held surprises, like it still mattered. She made him notice things he had stopped seeing. The way the leaves shimmered when the wind passed through them, the sound of birds calling to each other at dusk, the simple joy of sitting beside someone who listened not just with their ears, but with their heart. Yet, with every warm glance, every shared memory, a part of him resisted. This wasn't supposed to happen. He wasn't supposed to feel this again. He found himself pulling back, retreating into the safety of old routines. He would wake in the morning, determined to stay home, to avoid the park, to remind himself that this was foolishness. But by afternoon, his feet carried him back, as if on their own. Ruth never asked for more. She didn't push. She simply showed up, with her stories, her kindness, her quiet understanding. And that made it harder, because it wasn't just about her. It was about him, about what he was willing to let go of. The grief, the memories, the identity he had built around being someone who once had something beautiful and lost it. One evening, as they sat together on their usual bench, Ruth turned to him, her voice softer than usual. "Do you ever think about leaving? Just for a while?" Walter frowned slightly, unsure what she meant. "Leaving where?" She smiled gently, her eyes searching his. "This town. Seeing something new. I've always wanted to drive across the country. See the places I've only read about. I just never had the chance." The thought unsettled him. He hadn't left town in years. The idea of going anywhere, let alone on a trip, felt impossible. "I'm too old for that," he said, half laughing, half hoping she would drop it. But Ruth just looked at him, not with judgment, but with something softer. "Who told you that?" He didn't answer, because no one had told him. He had told himself. That night, Walter sat alone in his living room, the silence pressing in a little more than usual. He looked at the old map folded on the shelf, the one he and Helen had once marked with places they'd never seen. His fingers brushed the edges of it, and for the first time in years, he unfolded it. What if? The question lingered, not loud, but persistent. Walter didn't sleep much that night. The idea of traveling, of leaving the familiar streets, the house filled with memories, the routines that had become like old friends, stirred something restless inside him. He sat at the kitchen table, the old map spread out before him, his eyes tracing the faded lines that led to cities he had never visited, landscapes he had only seen in magazines or through the stories of others. His mind drifted back to the days when he and Helen would talk about taking trips after retirement, imagining what it would be like to drive along Route 66, to see the Grand Canyon, to hear the ocean in places far from home. They had always said there would be time, but time, he now knew, wasn't something you could count on. The next day at the park, Ruth noticed the change in him. He seemed quieter, more distant, his thoughts far from their usual easy conversation. "You're thinking about it, aren't you?" she asked softly. Walter nodded, still unsure of what to say. "It's a big step," he finally managed, his voice low. "I haven't left town in 20 years. I don't know if I can, if I should." Ruth placed her hand gently on his. It was warm, steady, the kind of touch that didn't ask for answers, only trust. "I'm not asking you to decide now. But life doesn't wait, Walter. You know that." He looked at her, really looked at her, and saw not just a woman with dreams, but someone offering him a second chance, not just at love, but at living. Over the next few days, Walter found himself caught between fear and curiosity. He didn't tell his sons about Ruth or the idea of traveling. He wasn't ready for their questions, their concern. Instead, he spent his time thinking about what it would feel like to be on the open road, to wake up in a new place, to see the world with someone who made him feel young again, if only for a moment. Ruth was patient. She didn't bring it up again, didn't press him. They continued their walks, their quiet talks, their moments of shared stillness. But one afternoon, as they sat beneath the oak tree, Walter spoke. "If I said yes, if I said I'd go, where would we go first?" Her face lit up, a smile spreading like sunlight breaking through clouds. "There's a place I've always wanted to see, the Grand Canyon. They say standing at the edge of it makes you feel like you're part of something bigger." Walter chuckled, the sound unfamiliar but welcome. "Bigger than 84 years. Much bigger," she said, squeezing his hand. And just like that, the decision was no longer a question, but a quiet promise. They would go. They would see what waited beyond the edges of their old lives. And maybe, just maybe, they'd find something neither of them expected. The days leading up to the trip felt surreal to Walter, like he was stepping into someone else's life, one he had only observed from afar. For so long, he had convinced himself that adventure belonged to the young, that comfort was enough, and that dreams were for people with more time. But now, each morning brought with it a flutter of nervous energy, something he hadn't felt in decades. Ruth made a list, not a long one, just the essentials: clothes, medications, maps, and a camera she insisted on bringing, though she admitted she didn't know how to use it properly. "We'll figure it out as we go," she said with a laugh. Walter moved slowly through his house, gathering what he thought he might need. He paused often, his hands resting on old objects filled with memories. A photograph of Helen on their wedding day, the old radio they used to listen to in the evenings, a drawer filled with postcards they had collected but never sent. He found himself wondering what she would think of this, of him going off into the unknown with someone new. A wave of guilt washed over him, sharp and sudden. But then he remembered her voice, soft and loving, always telling him to live, to not let grief become his home. He stood for a long moment, holding the photograph, before placing it gently back on the shelf. Ruth arrived the next morning, her small car packed and ready. She wore a wide-brimmed hat and sunglasses, her excitement barely contained. Walter hesitated at the doorway, looking back one last time at the house that had been his world for so long. It felt strange to leave it, even if just for a while. But as Ruth opened the passenger door and smiled, he felt something shift, a letting go, a quiet surrender to whatever lay ahead. The road stretched out before them, endless and unfamiliar. Walter sat silently for the first hour, watching the scenery change, the houses becoming fewer, the trees taller. Ruth hummed along to the music playing softly on the radio, an old tune from the 50s that made him smile, despite himself. The farther they drove, the lighter he felt, as if with each mile, the weight of years was peeling away. They stopped often, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. A small diner on the side of the road, where the waitress called them sweetheart, and the coffee was strong. A gas station with a dusty map taped to the window, marking the best places to see along Route 66. A field of sunflowers that seemed to stretch on forever, where Ruth insisted they take their first photo together. Walter began to see her differently now, not just as the woman who had sat beside him on a park bench, but as someone fearless, someone who still believed life had more to offer. And slowly, he began to believe it too. That night, they checked into a modest motel, the kind with neon signs and thin walls. As they sat outside, watching the stars emerge, Ruth turned to him. "Are you glad you came?" Walter looked up at the sky, vast and full of possibilities. "I think I'm starting to be." The next few days passed like a dream Walter didn't want to wake from. Each morning brought a new place, a new view, a new part of the country he had only ever seen in pictures or heard about in conversations long ago. They drove through small towns where time seemed to have stood still, the kind with old diners, faded signs, and friendly strangers who greeted them as if they had always been part of the community. Walter found himself laughing more, the sound feeling strange at first, like an old song he hadn't heard in years but still remembered the words to. Ruth had a way of turning every stop into something special. In one town, they visited an antique store where she found a dusty old record player that reminded Walter of the one he and Helen used to have. They didn't buy it, but they spent nearly an hour there, flipping through records, talking about their favorite songs, sharing stories of dances they had once attended in their youth. In another place, they stumbled upon a local fair, complete with cotton candy, Ferris wheels, and music that filled the air with nostalgia. Ruth dared him to ride the Ferris wheel, and though he protested at first, he found himself at the top, looking out over the lights below, holding her hand tightly, and feeling something he hadn't in so long, joy. As they continued west, the landscapes began to change. The flat roads gave way to rolling hills, then vast open deserts where the sky stretched endlessly in every direction. Walter would sometimes sit quietly, watching the horizon, lost in thought. Ruth never pushed him to talk, but when he did, he spoke of Helen, of the life they had built, the dreams they shared. Ruth listened, not with sadness, but with understanding, as if she knew that these memories were not competition, but pieces of who he was. One evening, after a long day of driving, they found themselves at a quiet overlook, the sun setting in brilliant shades of orange and red. They sat on a bench, the air warm, the world silent around them. "I never thought I'd see all this," Walter said softly, his eyes on the horizon. Ruth turned to him, her voice gentle. "What did you think you'd be doing?" He paused, thinking. "I thought I'd just wait. For the end, I guess. I didn't think there was anything left to begin." She took his hand, her touch light but steady. "You were wrong." And he knew she was right. Something inside him had shifted. He wasn't just on a trip across the country. He was on a journey back to himself, back to the man who once believed in more, who once had dreams and laughter and hope. Ruth hadn't replaced Helen. She had reminded him that love didn't have to end, that life didn't stop just because the years had passed. That night, as they checked into another small motel, Walter felt a peace he hadn't known in decades. He lay in bed, listening to the soft hum of the air conditioner, thinking about the miles they had traveled and the ones still ahead. He was no longer afraid. As they continued their journey, the miles became more than just distance traveled. They became memories stitched together by laughter, shared silences, and a growing sense of something neither of them had expected to feel again. Ruth had a way of noticing things that Walter often missed. She'd point out a flock of birds flying low against the sky, the way the wind rustled through a field of wheat, or the faded murals painted on the sides of old buildings in forgotten towns. Walter found himself looking at the world through her eyes, seeing beauty in places he would have once passed by without a second thought. They reached Las Vegas one bright, buzzing afternoon. Walter hadn't planned to stop there. The lights, the noise, the crowds. It all felt like too much for a man who had spent years in the quiet corners of life. But Ruth insisted, her eyes sparkling with mischief. "We don't have to gamble," she said, laughing. "Let's just see it, feel it." And so they did. They walked along the old strip, past casinos that had stood since the 50s, neon signs flickering above them, music spilling out onto the streets. Walter was overwhelmed at first, but as they wandered into a small lounge with a live band playing soft jazz, he relaxed. Ruth ordered 2 Cokes, served in glass bottles just like they used to be, and they sat back, letting the rhythm of the music settle over them. As the night wore on, Ruth leaned in, her voice low. "Dance with me." Walter's eyes widened. "I haven't danced in years." "Neither have I." There was no one else on the small dance floor, just a soft glow of lights and the music wrapping around them. Walter stood slowly, offering her his hand, and together they moved, slowly, carefully, but with a tenderness that needed no words. For a moment, time fell away. It wasn't about age or fear or the past. It was about now, about 2 hearts finding each other in the most unexpected place. After Las Vegas, they drove through the deserts of Arizona, stopping at roadside attractions that felt like relics from another era. The world's largest cactus, an old Route 66 diner with a jukebox still playing Elvis, a small chapel built into the side of a hill. Each place left its mark, not just on the map, but in Walter's heart. He began to understand that the journey wasn't about checking off places or chasing something lost. It was about presence, about sharing life in its simplest, purest form. Ruth had become more than a companion. She was his friend, his confidant, and, slowly, without needing to be named, something more. One morning, as they stood at the edge of a quiet canyon, the wind brushing gently against them, Walter turned to her. "I'm not the man I was when we started this." Ruth smiled, her eyes soft. "Neither am I." He reached for her hand, holding it not because he needed support, but because it felt right. "I'm glad you sat next to me that day," he said. "So am I." Their final stretch of the journey brought them to the Grand Canyon, the place Ruth had dreamed of since she was a girl. Walter had seen pictures of it before, but nothing could have prepared him for the vastness, the quiet majesty of it. They arrived just before sunset, the sky painted in deep oranges and soft purples, the canyon below glowing as if lit from within. They stood together at the edge, silent, the wind carrying with it the scent of earth and time. Walter took a deep breath, filling his lungs with the crisp, cool air. He looked out at the endless horizon, feeling both small and deeply connected to something far greater than himself. Ruth stood close, her hand resting lightly on his arm, her eyes fixed on the view. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Words, in that moment, seemed unnecessary. He thought about everything that had led him here, the years of solitude, the quiet routines, the belief that his life had settled into its final form. And yet, here he was, standing on the edge of something so vast it seemed to stretch beyond life itself. He turned to Ruth, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I don't know why I was so afraid." Ruth smiled, her gaze never leaving the canyon. "Because it's easier to stay still. It's safer." He nodded, understanding now what she had known all along. Safety wasn't living. Safety was waiting. That night, back at their small cabin near the canyon, Walter sat outside, wrapped in a blanket, watching the stars appear one by one. Ruth joined him, a warm cup of tea in her hands. They sat in silence for a while, the kind of silence that feels full, not empty. "I never expected this," he said finally. "Not just the places we've seen, but this. Us." Ruth looked at him, her eyes shining softly in the moonlight. "Neither did I, but I'm grateful." He reached for her hand, holding it gently. "I thought love was something that only happened once. That after Helen, I'd had my chance." Ruth squeezed his hand, her voice tender. "Love isn't about replacing anyone. It's about making room for more." Walter felt the truth of her words settle deep within him. He had spent so long guarding his heart, believing it had already given all it could. But now, he realized, the heart doesn't run out of love, it grows with it. As they sat there, the night wrapping around them, Walter felt something he hadn't felt in a long, long time. Not just peace, not just contentment. He felt alive. When Walter returned home, everything looked the same. The small house, the familiar streets, the old photographs still hanging on the walls. But something inside him had shifted so deeply that the world itself seemed different. Lighter, warmer. The silence that once felt like a weight now felt like space. Space for memories, yes, but also space for new moments still to come. Ruth didn't move in with him, at least not yet. They didn't need to rush. They had found something rare, something steady, and there was no need to chase it. Instead, they continued seeing each other, planning small trips, sharing meals, and simply enjoying the gift of each day. Walter woke each morning now with a sense of purpose, not grand or loud, but steady, a reason to get up, to smile, to look forward. One Sunday, as he sat on his porch, watching the sunlight filter through the trees, he thought about how close he had come to missing it all. How easily he could have stayed in his routine, his fear, believing that the best parts of life were behind him. But now he knew something different, something powerful. It's never too late. Not too late to feel again, to laugh again, to love again. Walter began to share his story in small ways, with friends at church, with the neighbor who always asked how he was doing, with the young man at the corner store who used to think of him as just the quiet old guy who bought the newspaper every morning. And every time he spoke, he saw it. The spark in their eyes, the flicker of recognition that maybe they, too, were waiting for life to surprise them. If he could say one thing to anyone listening, to anyone who had given up on the idea of new beginnings, it would be this: don't let the years tell you who you are. Don't let fear keep you from trying. And don't ever believe that love has a time limit. Because sometimes, the most beautiful chapters come when you least expect them. If you've ever felt like Walter, If you've ever wondered if it's too late for something new, take a moment and share your story with us in the comments. What dream do you still hold in your heart? What have you found, or what are you still hoping to find? Like this video if this story touched you, and subscribe to join a family that believes in second chances, in new beginnings, and in the simple truth that it's never too late to dream. Because we are all living proof. Life still has so much to give.